I didn't hear it fall. I woke in the middle of the night to silence, not the peaceful, comforting kind that lulls you back to sleep, but a silence that felt heavy, pressing down on me, as though the room itself was holding its breath. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment I couldn't tell what was wrong. The air was thick, almost metallic, with a faint echo I didn't recognize. It felt like the walls had expanded overnight, as though the room had grown larger while I slept. I sat up slowly, my pulse quickening, and that's when I saw it. The cross. It had always hung there above the bed, perfectly centered, a simple wooden thing that had been in the family for generations. My grandmother gave it to me when I moved into this apartment. She'd whispered something when she handed it over, a phrase I only half remembered, something about keeping the balance or reminding the walls. I hadn't paid much attention then, but now it was gone. I stared at the blank space on the wall, my mouth dry. I slid out of bed, feet touching the rug, and crossed to the wall where it had hung. There was no damage, no sign of it having fallen. No nail sticking out, just smooth, undisturbed plaster. I glanced down. The cross lay face down on the floor, directly below where it had been. It wasn't at an angle, it wasn't shifted or disturbed. It was perfectly aligned, as though it had been placed there, not dropped. I crouched down, reaching for it. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, a chill shot up my arm, sharp and sudden, like ice water coursing through my veins. I recoiled, gasping. The cross was freezing. Not the chill of a cold room or a draft, but something deeper, a cold that felt as though it had been pulled from the marrow of something long dead. I left it on the floor and backed away, breathing hard. The apartment felt wrong. I checked the windows, locked, curtains closed, no sign of forced entry. I listened for the familiar sounds of the old building settling, the groan of pipes, the creak of wood, the distant hum of the heater. But there was nothing. Just silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the hook had given out, or the vibrations from the heating system had knocked it down. I tried to rationalize it, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I got back into bed, pulling the covers tight, leaving the lamp on. That's when I noticed the smell. Not sulfur or rot, nothing so obvious. It was subtler, older, like dry paper left too long in a sealed box, mixed with the faintest hint of something sweet and metallic. It crept into my nose and throat, leaving a bitterness I couldn't shake. I glanced at the cross again, still on the floor. The lamp flickered. Just once. A brief, sickly pulse of light that threw the room into a distortion of shadows that didn't align with the furniture. I turned the light higher, leaning over the edge of the bed to stare at the wall where the cross had been. That's when I saw the markings. Not cracks or dust. Faint, deliberate etchings in the plaster, forming thin, shallow lines that curved and spiraled. Concentric circles intersected by jagged lines, forming a pattern that made my stomach churn. It was almost familiar, as though I'd seen it in a dream or a fleeting thought long forgotten. I reached out, running a fingertip over one of the lines. The wall felt soft, almost pliant beneath my touch, like old leather. Behind me, the cross creaked. I turned sharply. The room was still empty. No movement. But the light flickered again, weaker this time, and the shadows grew longer, stretching along the floor as though something was pulling them toward the center of the room. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting on the edge of the bed with every light in the apartment turned on. When dawn finally bled through the curtains, I checked the wall again. The markings were gone. The plaster was smooth, undisturbed. The cross still lay on the floor, but now when I picked it up, the wood felt warm against my skin. Not a comforting warmth, but a slow, steady pulse, like a faint heartbeat. I hung it back on the wall, driving the nail deep into the plaster. It hung there, still and silent, but the air in the room felt no lighter. The weight remained, All day I kept glancing at it, expecting it to fall again. That night I double-checked the nail, making sure it was secure. I left the lamp on and tried to sleep, but at exactly 3:17 a.m. I woke to the sound of it falling again. This time I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound, like wood settling against carpet. The smell was stronger, the air thicker, and on the wall, faintly glowing in the dim light, the markings had returned. Deeper, clearer, and this time they pulsed in sync with the faint heartbeat I felt in the floor beneath me. I froze, sitting up in bed, staring at the wall as the markings pulsed faintly in the dim light. They weren't just etchings anymore. They were alive, shimmering with a pale, sickly glow that seemed to ripple like breath. My skin crawled. The fine hairs on my arms, standing stiff as static, tingled along my spine. I stood slowly, my legs weak beneath me, drawn forward by some silent pull. The cross lay on the floor again, but this time it was turned upright, leaning against the wall, as if it had been placed there, as if something was waiting. The air felt thicker, almost syrupy, as though I was moving through something that resisted every step. The faint heartbeat in the floor had grown louder, not in volume, but in presence. A deep, thrumming vibration that seemed to resonate in the marrow of my bones. I could feel it in my teeth, in the pulse behind my eyes. I knelt to pick up the cross, but before my fingers could touch it, the markings on the wall flared. For an instant, the glow pulsed bright enough to cast shadows across the room, distorting everything into warped, elongated shapes. The pulse of light wasn't random. It beat in sync with the thrumming in the floor, with the racing of my heart, with a rhythm that felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. A whisper threaded through the air. Not a voice, not a sound, but an impression of a word that seemed to shape itself just behind the threshold of hearing. Remember. I recoiled, stumbling backward, knocking over the nightstand in my haste. The lamp shattered, plunging the room into a deeper, richer darkness that seemed to swallow the faint glow of the markings. But they remained, steady now, almost smug, like something had finally been acknowledged. I scrambled to the wall, flipping the light switch, but it did nothing. The power was gone. The apartment was silent, save for the insistent, pulsing beat that had now fully embedded itself into the fabric of the room. My chest tightened, my breath shallow, my pulse racing to match the rhythm. And then the shadows shifted. They stretched outward from the corners of the room, not random, not abstract, but purposeful. They coiled and writhed, slipping along the walls, converging on the space where the cross had once hung. The markings flared again, brighter, deeper, until the entire wall seemed to ripple like the surface of disturbed water. I tried to move, but my feet wouldn't obey. It was as if the air itself had turned solid, pinning me in place while the scene unfolded. A shape pressed forward from the wall. At first it was just a distortion, a deeper shadow against shadow. But as it emerged, it resolved into something almost humanoid, tall, thin, proportions all wrong, as though someone had taken a person and stretched them out like taffy. The face was featureless, save for two deep indentations where eyes should have been, black pits that shimmered faintly with the same sickly glow as the markings. Its hand, long, jointed, ending in sharp, tapering fingers, reached out, hovering just inches from the surface of the wall. "You were always part of this," it whispered directly into my mind. The pressure in the room increased. The heartbeat in the floor surged, matching the wild staccato of my own pulse. My vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping inward like ink bleeding through paper. The figure's hand touched the wall. The markings flared, the pulse resonating outward in concentric rings that rippled through the walls, through the air, through me. The floor trembled beneath my feet, a low, groaning vibration that made my teeth ache. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, oppressive air. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows folding over themselves, twisting into spirals of impossible depth. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The markings dimmed, fading back into the plaster until the wall looked as though nothing had ever marred its surface. The shadows retreated, slinking back into the corners, leaving the room bathed in a silence that was somehow even heavier than before. I collapsed to the floor, gasping, drenched in cold sweat. The cross lay beside me, untouched, ordinary. But the warmth it had held before was gone, replaced by a cold so profound it felt like an absence of warmth, a hollow chill that seeped into my skin. I left it there. I couldn't touch it, not after what I'd seen. The next morning, the cross was back on the wall. Hung perfectly, no sign of damage, no markings, no pulse in the floor. But the air still feels thick. The shadows still seem to shift when I'm not looking. And when I close my eyes, I can feel it waiting, watching, breathing.